Hormones and homeostasis. Claude Bernard in the 19th century was a French physiologist that first formulated the concept of homeostasis. He pointed out that an individual lives within two environments. One is the external environment that surrounds us, and the more important one is the internal environment. The internal environment is a fluid compartment within which the cells of our body are based. So the two words that makes homeostasis is one is homeo, which means similar, and stasis, which means standing, a state of standing. Refers to the existence of a stable internal environment. Various physiological processes act to prevent harmful changes in the composition of body fluids and the environment inside our cells. Maintaining a homeostatic control or homeostatic balance in our body is vital for organism survival. Failure to maintain that can be fatal and can lead to death. The homeostatic regulation is the adjustment of the physiological system to prevent a change in the homeostasis. Physiological systems have evolved to maintain homeostasis in the environment that is often inconsistent, unpredictable, and potentially hazardous. Think of your surroundings around you. You can have a snow day, or if you're going to a beach, the temperature can be 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In both the cases, the temperature regulation of the internal environment is very important. The homeostatic regulation involves two general mechanisms. One is autoregulation, the other is extrinsic regulation. Autoregulation is a process that occurs when a cell, tissue, organ systems adjust to the response to some environmental changes. Take, for example, when the oxygen levels decreases in a tissue, the cells release chemicals that widen or dilate the blood vessels in order to compensate that. This dilation increases the blood flow and provide more oxygen to those regions. So this is autoregulation within the body. It can be an effect that has stimulated from the external environment, and the internal environment adjusts accordingly. The extrinsic regulation is a process that results from activities of the nervous system and the endocrine system. These organ systems detect an environmental change and send an electrical signal or a chemical messenger to control or adjust the activities. In case of hormones, these are chemical messengers that are sent to the respective organs, tissues, or organ systems in order to combat that situation. For example, when you exercise, think about it. Your nervous system tissues commands that there is an increase in your heart rate, you're breathing heavy, so that the blood will circulate faster. The nervous system also causes blood flow to be reduced, okay, to less active organs, those which does not need activity at that point, for example, reproduction. So these are less active organs during your exercise. As such, it can be reproduction, it can be digestive system. You know, when you're exercising, I do not think you are thinking about digestion. The oxygen in the circulating blood is then available to other active organs, which, for example, muscles, brain would require more oxygen in order to, during the time that you exercise. Now, in response to this, there are two ways in this by which we control the homeostasis in our body. One is called the negative regulation or negative feedback loop. The other is known as a positive feedback loop. The negative feedback loop is to keep the variation in the key body systems within the ranges that are comparable for long-term survival. The body uses a method of homeostatic regulation, which is known as the negative feedback. In this process, the effector activated by the control, let's go to the next slide, you can see the endocrine tissue, which is the starting point of it, releases a hormone and acts on the effector, which is the target tissue. In this process, the effector, activated by the control center, in most of the cases it's the brain, opposes or negates the original stimulus. So it produces the hormones, the target releases another hormone which negates the release of these endocrine tissue to release more hormones. So there is the body basically, in this way, the negative feedback tends to minimize the change. So once it is released, when the amount is higher or the demands is met, the target tissue actually stops the release of the hormones by releasing another hormone or a metabolite from the endocrine tissue, so that it stops the release of the former hormone. On the other case, it is the positive feedback loop works in a little different manner. This occurs with rising concentration of the hormone, which causes another gland to release a second hormone. So again, the hormone is released from the endocrine gland tissue, which causes the release from the target tissue, which then is stimulatory to the increased output of the first hormone. So instead of stopping the release, you can see both are positive or plus sign showing here. Instead of stopping the release, it causes more release of these hormones, which becomes, a positive feedback. And gonadal hormones in women are an excellent example of it. And we will go over some of the examples of negative and positive feedback loop. So negative feedback, again, the output shuts off the original stimulus. And you can see in this case, we're talking about the temperature regulation. This is the normal body temperature. With rising temperature, for example, think of you are going to the beach, which is 100 or 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature has changed in the external environment. As a result, receptors in your body will notify a part of the brain which is known as hypothalamus. Very, very important. Hypothalamus actually regulates temperature. Apart from that, it has many other functions, and we will learn about hypothalamus as an endocrine organ later in the course. So this actually, it senses it, detects it. This is the hypothalamus. It detects it, and then it has its action, multiple actions. It causes sweat glands to really increase secretion in order to dissipate the heat. It increases blood vessels, the skins dilate, and as a result, the temperature, there is loss of heat, and the body temperature comes back to its normal temperature. So you can understand the output actually causes the output shuts off the original stimulus in this process. This is the negative feedback loop. On the other hand, the positive feedback loop, the example is during labor. Excellent example. During the process of labor, what happens is there are nerve impulses that actually go and activate the gland, the pituitary gland, the posterior end of the pituitary gland. Again, we'll be learning about pituitary gland at length in the subsequent lectures. So the pituitary gland releases a hormone which is known as oxytocin, and that is responsible for to cause contraction and relaxation of the uterus. And this in turn actually helps to push the fetus out of the cervix. So this process, once the contraction and relaxation of the uterus is, has started, more and more it causes the release of the oxytocin. It elevates the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary as the process continues. Once the fetus is delivered, no more contraction takes place. As such, the entire process stops. So this is a positive feedback loop, because the output enhances or exaggerates the original stimulus. So this is a very, very good example of a positive feedback loop. The other one positive feedback loop must be, I must mention it in here, is estrogen levels, which is released during the process of the entire ovarian cycle. Estrogen levels as well as the pituitary gonadal hormones levels increase simultaneously. When I say gonadotropic hormones, I mean luteinizing hormone, LH and FSH are also released. The monthly demise of the ovarian follicle, when it dies off or is removed from the process, the source of estradiol results in subsequent fall in the plasma estrogen, and the gonadal levels comes back to its normal levels. So the female reproductive system, release of estrogen in addition to LH and FSH. LH and FSH actually causes the release of estrogen. So this is, initially it is under the influence of negative feedback loop, but later as we becomes a positive feedback loop. So both the negative and positive feedback work hand in hand in order to facilitate this two process and in order for the entire process to go on. Okay. This actually brings us to one very interesting part, which is the two hormone system. In number of feedback system, there are not one, but two hormones actually work hand in hand in order to facilitate the entire process. Okay, so if you look in here, you will understand that the endocrine system or endocrine gland produces a hormone A, so that you can understand. So this acts on the target tissue positively. Okay, so in this process, the endocrine gland or tissue in turn can result in decrease in the metabolite, which can in turn act on the endocrine tissue. On the other hand, this target tissue can also, instead of decreasing the metabolite, can increase the metabolite and act on a different endocrine gland or tissue in order to increase the production. And this, when it increases it, hormone B is produced. This hormone B can have a negative effect on the target tissue in order to reduce its action. So here we are talking about two hormones working side by side in order to facilitate the entire physiological phenomenon. This is an interesting one, and we will learn about that. I have an example to show you how there are two hormones that work hand in hand in order to undergo the entire physiological process. This is an example of glucose homeostasis. Okay, so the glucose homeostasis is governed by two major hormones. There are other hormones, I want to make it clear, but here we are going to discuss about two hormones. One is the one that is produced, both of them are produced by the pancreas. One is insulin, the other is glucagon. Insulin, as you all well know, is a hormone produced by the pancreas, and it helps in removing sugar molecules from the blood. So basically, the release of insulin reduces the available sugar in the blood. And I'm pretty sure all of you know, if there is increased sugar levels in the blood, it causes a disease known as diabetes. On the other hand, there is another hormone, again, released by the pancreas, which is known as glucagon. And glucagon actually has just opposite effect of insulin. It increases the level of sugar in the blood. So let's understand. So this is a normal glucose level. And suppose, for example, you had 2 donuts in the morning. Okay, so 2 donuts, great, feeling really great after having those 2 donuts. And now what happens? The pancreas now thinks that there is a lot of glucose molecules in the blood and needs to act accordingly. As such, it will release insulin, and this release of the insulin causes several things. Number one, most of it is taken up by the cells. The other part is taken up by the liver, and the glucose molecule is converted and stored in the form of glycogen. Now, this glycogen remains there. As and when required, it will release. This is one scenario. Okay, since these are taken up, since the blood no longer has excess glucose in them, the blood sugar level comes back to normal. So the homeostatic control by negative feedback has taken place. On the other hand, what happens is it might be you just forgot to have your breakfast and lunch, you are fasting, and your blood glucose level goes down. Now, pancreas again detects a lower glucose level in the blood, as such releases another hormone which is known as glucagon. Now, this glucagon has two functions. What it does is it now acts on the liver. Remember, the liver stored glucose in the form of glycogen for future use, and now the glucagon actually acts on them in order to convert the glycogen into glucose. Now we need glucose, and as such, this glucose that is released from the liver goes into the blood and keeps the homeostasis blood glucose level normal. So these are the two hormones that are working hand in hand in order to keep the physiological balance in our body. There's another example of calcium homeostasis, which is also very important. Calcium, remember, is required by all cells in the body for a variety of functions. The calcium ion, which is Ca2+, is needed for clotting of blood. It is required by other cellular functions also. Remember, it is required for muscle contraction. So this ion is required undoubtedly for many, many functions, and to keep a homeostatic control is very important. So any deviation from the set the normal levels will cause homeostatic imbalance, which can be detrimental. So there are two glands that help in controlling the calcium level. One is a thyroid gland, which produces hormone calcitonin, and the other is produced by the parathyroid gland, which is also a very important producer, a very important hormone, which is known as parathyroid hormone. So what happens is this hormone, which is produced by the thyroid gland or the parathyroid gland, these help in keeping the homeostatic control of calcium under normal levels. So what happens with the rising calcium levels in the blood, if the levels of calcium increases, calcitonin is produced. It causes several things. Number one, it causes increased secretion of calcium in kidney. Calcium, since there is an increased levels of calcium, it's trying to get rid of it. There is calcium deposition in the bone, so that osteogenesis is increased, that is formation of bone is increased because calcium levels are higher in the blood and it needs to be used. So this causes the blood calcium levels to decline. On the other hand, if there is falling calcium levels, the calcium levels have gone down, in that case there is release of stored calcium from the bone. Osteolysis results, bones decay and releases calcium. So in order to increase the calcium levels, there is enhanced reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys, stimulation of calcitrol produced at kidneys. They also causes increased level of calcium, so blood calcium levels that increase. The point here is to understand that there are systems in our body in order to keep the calcium homeostasis under control. And it is done by thyroid gland by producing calcitonin, and by parathyroid gland, which produces parathyroid hormone. So the neuroendocrine integration of homeostasis. What it means is, here we are talking about how the nervous system and the endocrine system are working hand in hand in order to facilitate the homeostasis in your body. We'll take each of these examples separately. The first is the neuroendocrine regulation of fluid homeostasis is mediated by vasopressin. So when we say vasopressin, what the other name for vasopressin is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. This hormone is produced by the posterior pituitary. It is required for water retention. If water is lost and not replaced, dehydration will result. Okay, so it is important, the increase in the fluid. Remember, when there is a loss of fluid, there is loss of sodium ions. So this is very detrimental. The other is decrease in the fluid volume, which is known as hypovolemia, is also very, very detrimental to our body. So integration of this information within the hypothalamus results in release of this hormone, which is known as vasopressin or ADH, from the neurons, and these components actually help in the retention of water from the kidneys. So ADH acts on the kidneys, nephrons. There are collecting ducts or collecting tubules in the nephron where these ADH act on it and causes the retention of water. And this in turn helps to keep the homeostasis under control. Next is, as we already learned about this, is the neuroendocrine control of body temperature regulated by the hypothalamus. And there are hormones that do it. One is the thyroid hormone, and there is autonomic activity that also helps in controlling the neuroendocrine control of body temperature. The temperature of the body, it has to be maintained. Remember, it has to be under precise control. But remember, this is under a circadian rhythm. That is, the temperature of your body does change during the day and night. Hormones and neuronal mechanisms are very important. They keep the temperature under control. Alteration in the body temperatures are monitored very closely by the sensory neurons within the brain. These neurons release neurotransmitters, substances that stimulate other neurons to initiate physiological processes that lead to warming or cooling of the body back into the normal state. That was the example we just learned about the negative feedback loop. A hormone released by the neuroendocrine cells within the hypothalamus of the brain stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormones, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary. This hormone released into the circulation stimulates the cells of the thyroid gland. This is the point that we are discussing right now. So the hormone is the thyroid stimulating hormone. It has its effect on the thyroid gland, which produces thyroid hormones. What are they? They are thyroxine and triiodothyronine, which stimulate the metabolism of various cells of the body, which results in the heat production. So whenever there is heat production, this causes the body temperature to come back to its normal level. There are other systems which is part of the autonomic nervous system, which also help in maintaining the heat production or keeping the homeostatic control of heat regulation in our body. The last part is the neuroendocrine control of energy homeostasis. Here we are talking about how energy is consumed and controlled in our body. The body weight in general is controlled within the very narrow limits in the neuroendocrine homeostatic control of mechanism. So body weight regulation. There are hormones, there are several hormones that do the task. Many of these cells are endocrine cells, are neuropeptides, neurotransmitters that can alter the food intake. They can be orexigenic, which means it stimulates food intake. Orexigenic is spelled as OREXIGENIC, orexigenic. Our anorexigenic, which is anorexigenic, which inhibit food intake. So we are talking about the third point. So there are two terms here: orexigenic, that stimulate the food intake, and anorexigenic, which inhibit the food intake. Both of them are controlled by estrogen. These are hormones that are able to control your food intake. There is a very well-known hormone, which is called leptin, which is able to keep the food intake under control. There are other hormones like estrogen, which also is responsible to keep the energy homeostasis of your body under control. So we know that hormones have an effect on the behavior. Okay, so we'll take an example, first example. So first is, hormones do not cause a particular behavior to change. Rather, they change the likelihood that a particular behavior will occur in an appropriate environment or context. The best example of it is testosterone, which is very, very related with behavior in humans. Certain behaviors can also influence hormone levels. For example, testosterone levels can rise or fall depending upon whether the contest has been won or lost. So in case of roosters and animals, it has been seen, and even in humans, actually, it has been seen that the levels of testosterone will rise whenever the environment is in a winning position. Adrenal, which is epinephrine levels, will rise whenever there is a contest is won. On the other hand, the hormones level may go down in a different situation. This, whether a behavior influences the release of hormone or the hormone release affects the behavior, is very debatable. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem. We really don't know which influences first over the other. So in order to understand all of this, let's understand some experiments that will help us to understand these three phenomena better. So first and foremost, if we remove the source of a particular hormone, then a behavior that is assumed to depend upon that hormone should disappear. So if it is dependent and we remove that hormone, that behavior should cease. For example, removal of testosterone by castration. If you remember Berthold's experiment, if you remove the testes by castration, it drastically reduces the sexual drive and aggressive behavior in male animals. So definitely they are dependent on each other. Number two, once a behavior has ceased following the hormone removal, can we restore it if we put the hormones back or the organ back that produces the hormone? Does that restore the aggressive behavior in roosters? And we saw that it does. Now, when Berthold actually removed the testes by castration and then added or replanted them into the abdominal cavity, it did cause the restoration of the aggressive behavior. The hormones, if hormones and certain behaviors are related, then we should expect that alteration in the relative concentration of the hormone should produce relative alteration in behavior. And yes, it is true, aggressive behaviors should be higher when the circulating levels of testosterone is high, and that has been proven by experiments. So with that actually came later on, as we went along, it was found that hormones also had an effect on growth regulation, growth behavior, and oncogenes that can have cancerous effect. Yes, hormones are very, very important for regulation of calcium, ions, sodium ion balance, and several other cellular activities in our body, whether it be cell, tissue, organ, or organ system, but they can be little detrimental at certain times, because high levels of these hormones can lead to many cancerous cells, uncontrolled growth of cells, and that became another field of study in case of hormones. Hormones, apart from the major physiological importance, have been used in some artificial techniques, which are known as artificial reproductive techniques, in order to facilitate infertility. Okay, so there are several techniques now used in order to combat infertility in men and women. This YouTube video will help you to understand one of them, which is intrauterine insemination. There is IVF, in vitro fertilization, ICSI, and many other artificial techniques that are used in order to combat infertility. And in all of this, hormones are used in order to facilitate, either to increase the overproduction, to make hair more susceptible to implantation. It can be to increase the sperm motility, and so on and so forth. So hormones, apart from the normal physiological functions of hormones have a huge other importance in our lives in order to facilitate and make our lives better. So with this, we end the lecture. I hope the introduction of endocrinology will help you to understand the importance of hormone and its function.